Imagine for a moment a night in the dead of winter, somewhere in Europe 500 years ago. There is no heating, no sealed windows, and the wind slips through every crack in your dwelling. The temperature is so low that even the water in the well has turned into a solid block. You are living in the heart of the Little Ice Age, a period roughly between the 14th and 19th centuries when Europe experienced winters that were longer and colder than usual. Chroniclers of the time recorded snowfalls that covered entire villages, ruined harvests, and at times, rivers as large as the Thames in London or the Seine in Paris completely frozen for months. Ice did not only halt river trade. In some winters, city dwellers took the opportunity to set up fairs on the frozen river. In London, for example, stalls were built, games were organized, and even makeshift taverns were set up on the ice. But while in the cities these fairs were cause for celebration, in the countryside the reality was very different. For peasants, a severe winter could mean the difference between surviving and freezing to death. In the poorest villages, warmth was a scarce commodity. One of the most ingenious and dangerous solutions to fight the night cold was the use of so-called bedstones. These were large stones, sometimes bricks or even chunks of iron, heated for hours by the fire. They were then wrapped in cloths or hides and placed in the bed to warm the blankets. The problem was that if the stone was not completely dry or had tiny fissures, the sudden change in temperature could cause it to explode, sending fragments flying and burning anyone nearby. Even so, it was a risk many accepted to avoid a freezing night. Another common strategy was for everyone to sleep in the same bed. Parents, children, and even grandparents shared the same space to make the most of body heat. In many families, this improvised human sleeping bag also included small animals, dogs, cats, and even chickens, which, wrapped in blankets, provided extra warmth. It was not uncommon to find references in parish records to families who literally slept with half the barn inside the house during the harshest winter nights. In some rural areas, especially in very humble homes, there was not even a chimney. Families kept the fire burning in the center of the dwelling and let the smoke fill the interior. Although it may sound unpleasant, this smoke had a double purpose. It not only helped retain heat, but also drove away fleas, lice, and other insects, which were a constant problem in medieval life. Of course, breathing that smoke-laden air was far from healthy and could cause respiratory problems. But under those circumstances, the priority was to survive the cold. In the mountainous regions of Europe, where temperatures could be extreme, there existed a custom as curious as it was effective, literally burying people under blankets and layers of hay. It was a very rudimentary insulation method, but dry hay trapped body heat and created a microclimate in which one could get through the night without freezing. This habit was used especially for children, the elderly, or the sick, the most vulnerable to the cold. Sleepwear, as we understand it today, practically did not exist for most peasants. Sleeping naked was unthinkable. Instead, they went to bed in their daytime clothes, including hose, shirts, and in many cases, the very coat they wore to work. It was not unusual for someone to climb into bed with boots and hat on. The hat, in fact, was not just for daytime use. In winter, keeping the head covered was essential to prevent heat loss. Even the best prepared houses offered minimal insulation. Walls were usually made of wood or wattle and daub, and the windows, when they existed, did not have glass, but parchment or stretched animal bladder. These materials let in some light, but also the cold. That is why, on the harshest winter days, many families reduced their activities and took refuge in the smallest room in the house, which became both living space and bedroom. Medieval accounts also mention a custom that may surprise you: sleeping with livestock on the ground floor of the house. This was especially common in alpine regions and cold areas of Scotland and Scandinavia. Houses were built with two levels. Cows, goats, and sheep were kept on the lower floor, and the family lived on the upper floor. The heat given off by the animals rose and helped maintain a more bearable temperature in the rooms. Winter also completely altered the daily routine. Scarce sunlight limited working hours in the fields, so many tasks were moved indoors, repairing tools, weaving, making utensils, or preparing preserves for the rest of the year. The nights, long and dark, were filled with stories, songs, and prayers. It was also the season of the most intense superstitions. People believed the cold brought evil spirits, and so some families hung sprigs of holly or bags of garlic on doors and windows to protect themselves from the invisible. In short, survival on the coldest nights did not depend on a single method, but on a combination of ingenuity, tradition, and sheer physical endurance. From stones that could explode to sleeping with animals, through smoke-filled houses and people buried in hay, every resource had its logic and, above all, answered a single need: to wake up alive the next day. Black bread and extreme food. In the Middle Ages, a peasant's diet was determined by two factors that did not always play in their favor: the quality of the harvest and the ability to preserve food for months. If the first failed, the ingenuity and resilience of the stomach were tested in ways that seem unthinkable today. Bread was the staple of the diet in almost all of Europe, but not all breads were the same. White bread, made from pure wheat, was a luxury reserved for nobles and wealthy townsfolk. Peasants ate black bread, made from rye, oats, or barley, often mixed. In normal years, this bread was coarse, strongly flavored, and dense crumbed. But in poor harvests, creativity or desperation forced people to seek less appetizing alternatives. In various records by chroniclers from the 14th and 15th centuries, we find descriptions of bread made with ground tree bark mixed with the little flour available. At other times, acorn flour was added, which, although nutritious, was bitter and contained tannins that, if not properly treated, could be toxic. The result was a dark, heavy loaf with an unpleasant flavor, but in extreme situations, it could mean the difference between eating something and eating nothing. In some regions, especially in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, there was the so-called year bread. These were gigantic loaves so large they could weigh more than 10 kilos. They were baked once and left to dry until they hardened like stone. This bread was not cut. It was scraped with a knife or struck with an axe to extract small flakes, which were then soaked in soups or milk. This method allowed it to be kept for months, although the flavor turned rancid over time. Soups and stews were another pillar of the peasant diet. They were often prepared in a cauldron that was never completely washed, so the remnants from the previous day enriched the flavor of the next. In times of scarcity, ingredients could be as humble as turnips, cabbages, wild herbs, and gnawed bones. But in the poorest areas, especially near rivers and ponds, people turned to ingredients that would surprise us today: snails, frogs, and even earthworms, boiled together with vegetables to add some protein. Medieval testimonies did not consider this shameful. It was simply a matter of survival. Cheese, by contrast, offered a very different picture. In some regions of the Mediterranean and northern Italy, there was a custom of eating cheese with live maggots. Far from being seen as a defect, the presence of larvae indicated that the cheese was at a very intense point of fermentation, making it softer and spicier. Today, Sardinian casu marzu is the heir to that tradition. In the Middle Ages, however, this type of cheese could be found in local markets and was not as stigmatized as it would be today in most cultures. During feasts and celebrations, the picture improved slightly. If a family slaughtered an animal, for example, a pig in winter, every part was used, from the meat to the fat, the blood, and the offal. A widely used preservation technique consisted of burying pieces of meat in containers filled with fat. The fat acted as a barrier against air and bacteria, allowing the meat to remain edible for months. This method, similar to French confit, had the advantage of preserving flavor and texture better than salting or smoking, although it did not always prevent a rancid taste from developing over time. Fresh meat, in fact, was a luxury enjoyed only on rare occasions. Poultry such as chickens and geese were kept more for eggs or feathers than for eating. Large livestock, cows and oxen, were rarely slaughtered, as they were more useful alive for producing milk and working the fields. For that reason, when a peasant family ate beef, it was almost always because the animal had died of disease or accident. In many places, the diet was rounded out with legumes such as peas and lentils, but even here, there were social differences. While monasteries cultivated finer, tastier varieties, in the countryside people worked with lower quality seed that produced tougher, harder to digest grains. The lack of variety and the constant reliance on the same foods caused health problems such as scurvy or pellagra, deficiency diseases whose origins were not always understood but were common among peasants. The response of folk medicine included remedies like boiling certain herbs or adding vinegar to meals which, unbeknownst to them, could supply some vitamin C and prevent complications. Even in the culinary realm, superstitions were present. Some families believed bread should not be cut at night because it attracted bad luck. Others thought that eating the first loaf of a new batch without sharing it with someone else could bring misfortune. And in times of famine, there were stories of cursed loaves that made those who ate them sick, probably real cases of poisoning by molds or by ergot on rye, a fungus that could cause hallucinations and convulsions. Extreme food in the Middle Ages was not an occasional rarity, but a constant for much of the peasant population. Every winter, every bad harvest was a test of endurance and ingenuity. And although some of these practices may seem unappetizing today, in their time, they were vital strategies for staying alive until the next harvest. Lights, shadows, and unsettling nightlife. In the Middle Ages, night was much more than a simple change of light. For a medieval peasant, sundown meant the arrival of a different world, one ruled by silence, cold, and above all, the fear of the unknown. With no public lighting and houses lit only by the faint glow of the fire, darkness was almost total. And that darkness was not merely physical, it was loaded with superstitions, beliefs, and very real dangers. One of the most curious and unsettling objects used to light the night were lamps made from animal skulls. They were common in rural areas where the scarcity of metals meant every available material was used to the fullest. The skull, cleaned and hollowed out, was filled with animal or vegetable oil, and a wick was placed in a cavity. When lit, the light filtered through the eye sockets and mouth, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Although their use was mainly practical, in some rural cultures, it was believed these lamps protected the house from evil spirits, tapping into the animal's symbolic power. But not all nocturnal lights were welcome. In many regions of Europe, people feared the appearance of so-called evil lights, or will-o'-the-wisps. These sudden flickers, seen especially in marshy areas or open fields, were attributed to lost souls, demons, or even witches. Today we know they were probably caused by the combustion of gases such as methane or phosphine released by decomposing organic matter. However, for the medieval peasant, encountering these lights could be a bad omen. Some tales said following them led to death or to becoming lost forever in the forest. Fear of the night was not only superstition. Many villages maintained the figure of the night watchman, a person in charge of patrolling the streets and ensuring there were no thefts, fires, or forbidden activities. And forbidden did not always mean common crimes. In times of religious hysteria, the watchman was also expected to report any sign of witchcraft or heresy. This included nighttime gatherings, strange songs, or the simple act of wandering outside without a reason approved by the feudal lord. Despite everything, nightlife was not completely inactive. There was the custom of first sleep and second sleep, a biphasic rest pattern common before the advent of artificial lighting. People went to bed shortly after dusk and slept about 4 hours. Then they woke, often around midnight, and stayed active for 1 or 2 hours before going back to sleep until dawn. In that interval, they prayed, talked, prepared bread, tended animals, or even visited nearby neighbors. Not all of these nighttime activities were well regarded. Court documents tell of trials against people accused of going out at night without permission. Feudal control over peasants' time and activities could be so strict that walking the fields after curfew was considered a serious offense. In some cases, it was alleged that these outings were to practice forbidden rites or to steal crops. Mere suspicion could suffice to impose fines or corporal punishment. Night was also when oral storytelling spread most widely. By the warmth of a fire or under the roof of a smoke-filled hut, elders told legends of ghosts, saints, and battles past. Many of these stories served as disguised warnings. Do not enter the forest, do not talk to strangers, do not disobey the Lord. Others sought to explain natural phenomena like the wolves howling or wood creaking in the middle of the night. In villages near monasteries or churches, the night was marked by the bells calling to the night offices. Monks rose for matins or vigils, and that sound cut through the silence, reminding everyone of the constant presence of the sacred and of supervision. In some places, darkness was even a tool of defense. Isolated villages avoided placing too much lighting so as not to attract the attention of bandits or armies on campaign. Only a few controlled bonfires marked the boundaries of the settlement. Lastly, remember that the medieval night was populated by animals we rarely associate with human life today. Wolves, foxes, and wildcats were frequent visitors, and the mere sound of their steps could sow panic in a community that saw in them not only predators, but possible messengers of evil. In short, the medieval knight combined ingenuity to light the darkness, a deep respect and fear for the invisible, and strict social vigilance. Between lamps made of skulls, mysterious lights over the fields, and watchmen guarding order and orthodoxy, every dawn was a relief, the end of a territory where the rules changed and where, for better or worse, light altered everything. Ingenious and surprising reuse. In medieval Europe, nothing went to waste. The chronic poverty of most of the population and the difficulty of accessing new resources meant that any object, no matter how humble, had more than one useful life. What we would consider trash today was then seen as raw material. And in that survival economy, ingenuity mixed with practices that would strike us as shocking or even repulsive. A clear example was the use of hides from animals that had died of disease to waterproof roofs. During epidemics of plague or other animal pests, the meat was often discarded for fear of contagion, but the hides were not always wasted. Cured in a rudimentary way, often simply sun-dried and treated with salt, they were laid over the roofs of houses or barns to keep out the rain. Although this improved waterproofing, it could also bring persistent odors and attract insects, but it was a cheap resource available in times of crisis. Monasteries, which accumulated documents and parchments, were also an involuntary source of reuse. In times of need, some of those old, damaged, or obsolete parchments ended up being transformed into unsuspected objects like shoes. Sheets of parchment made from treated animal skin were tough and flexible. Once folded and stitched, they could serve as part of a sole or the upper of footwear. While not the most comfortable option, they did protect against damp and mud. Today, some archaeological finds in monastic areas have revealed fragments of medieval writing and pieces of footwear, direct witnesses to this practice. In the domestic sphere, creativity reached even the human body itself. Hair collected from brushes and combs was not thrown away, especially in households where men and women with long hair could supply large amounts. That hair was braided or twisted to make fine cords, useful for sewing nets, reinforcing garments, or even as material for musical instruments like violin bows. Although human hair is not as strong as other fibers, its availability made it valuable in an economy where every thread counted. Metal was one of the most prized and thus most recycled materials. Any broken piece, from a spoon to a hinge, was melted down to produce new objects. Sometimes the amounts were small and fragments of different metals were mixed, giving rise to mosaic utensils in which veins and patches of different hues could be seen. A knife, for example, might have an iron-forged blade with accidental copper or bronze inclusions from other utensils melted alongside it. This was not only a matter of economy but also sheer necessity. Extracting and working new metal was expensive and required expertise not always available in villages. One of the most curious uses of animal materials was the inflated pig bladder. Once cleaned and dried, the bladder became a lightweight container for carrying liquids, especially in small amounts. Beyond its practical use, it also served in play. Inflated and tightly sealed, it made a ball for children and even for rudimentary sports played at fairs or religious celebrations. These balls were sturdy and bounced surprisingly well, though over time they lost elasticity and burst. The principle uniting all these practices was simple. In a society without mass industrial production, making something new required resources and time not always within a peasant's reach. Reusing what was available was not just a matter of thrift, but of survival. And this reuse did not know the moral limits we would impose today. If something could serve a purpose, it was used regardless of its origin or appearance. Even bones had their role. The largest were carved into knife handles, sewing needles, or game pieces. Smaller ones could be crushed and mixed with lime to reinforce walls or floors. In some areas, fat extracted from old bones was used to make emergency candles, although they gave off an unpleasant smell. In ports and fishing villages, torn nets were repaired with fragments of old ropes made not only of hemp or linen, but also of improvised fibers like strips of leather or dried animal tendons. The result might look like a collage of materials, but it did the job. Reuse was also seen in clothing. A torn garment was rarely discarded. Instead, it was patched with pieces from other worn-out garments. Finer fabrics were reserved for lining the insides of rougher garments, and the smallest scraps ended up as kitchen rags or wrapping for delicate objects. Even ash from the hearth, seemingly useless, was collected to make homemade lye, used in washing clothes and as a basic cleaner. In today's context, these practices may seem extreme, but in the Middle Ages, they were everyday life for millions. What we now call recycling was simply common sense then. And thanks to this mentality, many peasants managed to stretch resources to the limit and endure in times of scarcity. Necessity-driven creativity left a tangible legacy: hybrid objects, improvised inventions, and solutions that, though humble, were essential for daily life. From roofs waterproofed with hides to balls made from pig bladders, each of these examples is a window into a world where survival literally depended on wasting nothing. Drinking to live or die. In the Middle Ages, drinking was not a simple everyday gesture but a matter of survival, and sometimes of mortal risk. In a world without treated running water and with wells exposed to all kinds of contamination, what one drank could make the difference between a healthy life and a quick death. One of the most common resources was light beer, known in some regions as small beer. It had so little alcohol, sometimes less than 2%, that even children drank it as a substitute for water. The reason was simple. The fermentation process eliminated some of the bacteria and pathogens present in the liquid, making it a safer option than drinking straight from a well or river. However, it was not always infallible. If the barrel was poorly cleaned or fermentation failed, the beer could be contaminated with fungi or bacteria that caused diarrhea, vomiting, and in the worst cases, death. Even so, for the medieval peasant, the risk seemed small compared to the invisible threat of stagnant water. In fruit-growing regions such as Normandy or Asturias, the everyday drink could be cider. Produced artisanally, it often fermented in wooden barrels that were not always well sealed. This caused the natural gas of fermentation to be trapped, creating bubbles that, unknowingly, turned the cider into a rudimentary version of what we would now call sparkling. This phenomenon was celebrated at local festivals, though it also carried dangers. Uncontrolled fermentation could produce vinegary flavors or even contaminate the drink with molds that led to intoxication. Mead was another widespread beverage, especially in areas where beekeeping was part of the local economy. It mixed honey with water and was left to ferment into a sweet alcoholic liquid. In certain contexts, especially at religious festivals or pagan celebrations absorbed by Christianity, it was flavored with herbs that we now know had hallucinogenic or sedative effects. Plants such as henbane, datura, or mugwort were added to bless the drink and bring participants closer to the divine, though excessive consumption could cause hallucinations, disorientation, and in some cases death. In the cold months, there was another peculiar custom: plunging red-hot iron into the drink before consuming it. Besides heating the liquid, this gesture was believed to purify it thanks to the strength of the metal and contact with fire. The method was applied both to beer and young wine, and the sizzle when the glowing bar was immersed was part of the ritual. In practice, the heat killed some bacteria but also imparted an unpleasant metallic taste. Despite all these efforts to avoid illness, the relationship with water remained ambiguous. In many villages, wells were blessed by the priest to guarantee their spiritual purity, even if they were located only a few meters from latrines, pens, or dumps. Faith in divine protection was so strong that few questioned the sanitary logic. And although at times the water could be relatively safe, the proximity of sources of contamination made waterborne epidemics spread easily in summer. Medieval chroniclers recorded numerous outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and typhus linked to the consumption of contaminated water. Paradoxically, the poorest areas, which could not afford to produce large quantities of beer or wine, relied most on direct water and were therefore most exposed. Taverns played a crucial role in this liquid culture. They were gathering places where one could drink wine, beer, cider, or mead without worrying about the water's origin. However, not all beverages served were pure. There was a practice of reviving a stale drink with spices, honey, or even charcoal to mask unpleasant smells and flavors. These methods, while effective at tricking the palate, did not remove health risks. Drink was not only survival, but also a social symbol. A guest offered wine was being honored. A laborer was rewarded with beer or cider. In some agricultural contracts, part of the payment was made in liters of fermented drink, showing its value in daily life. But this dependence on fermented liquids had a dark side. Although light beer did not easily intoxicate, stronger versions did, and judicial records of the period include numerous violent incidents related to alcohol. At fairs and on feast days, it was not uncommon for too much cider or wine to end in fights, injuries, or in extreme cases, homicides. In short, in the Middle Ages, drinking was no trivial act. It was a delicate balance between necessity, tradition, and risk. Fermented beverages offered a partial defense against the invisible danger of dirty water, but they could themselves become poison if brewing failed or if consumed in excess. Between everyday light beer, sparkling cider from ill-sealed barrels, mead with potent herbs, and wells blessed yet contaminated, the medieval table reminds us of a simple, brutal truth. To live, one had to drink, but every sip was, at heart, a small act of faith. Peasant medicine that today looks like witchcraft. In medieval villages where access to trained physicians was a luxury reserved for nobles, monasteries, and large cities, a peasant's health depended almost entirely on remedies handed down from generation to generation. These practices, a blend of empirical observation, religious beliefs, and ancestral superstitions, could be as ingenious as they are bewildering to our modern mindset. Some worked by sheer chance. Others probably had no effect beyond suggestion or faith. One of the most striking methods was placing a live toad on a wound to draw out the poison or suck out the infection. The logic behind this was not entirely absurd by the thinking of the time. The toad, an animal associated with dampness and venom, could absorb a person's evil, acting as a temporary vessel for the illness. In some cases, the toad was held in place with bandages until it died, at which point it was interpreted as having fulfilled its mission. Although from a modern perspective there is no evidence this worked, it is likely the moisture of the animal's skin momentarily soothed the burning sensation of superficial wounds. Another widespread remedy was the use of powdered stag horn against toothache. The horn, ground to a fine powder, was applied directly to the affected gum or mixed with wine. The belief was that the stag, for its longevity and hardiness, transmitted part of its strength to whoever consumed it. In medieval symbolism, horns also carried connotations of protection and regeneration. In some cases, the analgesic effect may have come more from the alcohol or added herbs than from the horn itself. To protect the family from contagious diseases, it was common to hang a dried snakeskin on the door. This gesture, which today might seem a purely superstitious amulet, was tied to the idea that the snake, by shedding its skin, defeated death and was reborn. Thus, placing its skin at the entrance served as a magical barrier against ills that traveled through the air or entered with sick visitors. In villages where plague or typhus had left their mark, such skins could be seen on several houses, especially in winter when respiratory illnesses were more common. Perhaps one of the strangest remedies for fever was to pass the sick person under a donkey's belly. According to the belief, the animal, being robust and resilient, could absorb the person's illness. The ritual was usually repeated 3 times, and in some regions included prayers or chants while it was performed. The number 3, rich with Christian symbolism, reinforced the perceived efficacy of the act. Although there was no medical basis for this, the contact with the animal and the community's participation could have a psychological effect of relief. On the more practical and somewhat grounded side was the use of fermented honey and ash on open wounds to promote healing. Honey, even unfermented, has antibacterial properties known today, combined with ash, which has a drying and slightly alkaline effect. This ointment could reduce bacterial proliferation in the wound. It is an example of how empirical observation, repeated over generations, could lead to practices with real value, even if wrapped in ritual and magical belief. Beyond these remedies, peasant medicine included a vast repertoire of infusions and poultices made from local plants: nettle to purify the blood, garlic as an amulet against plague, or sage for memory and sore throats. Many of these plants did have beneficial active compounds, although dosages and mixtures were based more on tradition than on chemical knowledge. In the medieval mindset, illness was not merely a physical problem. It could be the result of sin, the evil eye, or the action of invisible forces. Thus, alongside physical treatments, people relied on prayers, blessings, and domestic exorcisms. A peasant might receive an herbal infusion and at the same time wear a piece of blessed bread tied around the neck for protection. Healers, figures respected and feared in equal measure, kept in their memory and in symbolic objects an arsenal of practices. Their knowledge was transmitted orally, often mixing pagan elements with Christian ones. Some even kept rudimentary records on parchment, though to avoid accusations of witchcraft, they preferred to keep much of their knowledge secret. This survival medicine did not always save lives, but it did maintain a social fabric in which the community was involved in the healing of its members. The rituals, though ineffective by modern medical standards, provided comfort and a sense of control in the face of illness's unpredictability. And in a world where death was always near, that could be as important as the cure itself.